Hello everyone, welcome to the sixth lecture of this massive open online course on Sociology of Development. If you can slightly recall, in the first 2 weeks, we have discussed historical location of the idea of development and decolonization, end of colonialism, rise of nationalism in the third world and the desire for development. In the 5 lectures, we have discussed these two very important components of how to historically situate the idea of development, and also we have discussed decolonization and how the third world, how the colonized nations, they tried to garner the voices, rather nationalistic voices against imperialism, against colonialism, and how to make development possible. Okay? And in this week, in terms of 2 lectures, we are going to discuss classical sociology, the notions of social change, evolution, ideas of evolution, progress, and so on. Okay? To start with, if you look at this, to start with classical sociology, evolution, the ideas of evolution and progress, okay, let's start with Hegel. Okay. I am going to look at this component, this week's lectures, through the works of Robert Nisbet, okay. And as Hegel pointed out, the principle of development, development within quote, okay, the principle of development involves also the existence of a latent germ of being, a capacity or potentiality striving to realize itself. This formal conception of development finds actual existence in spirit, which has the history of the world for its theatre, its possession, and the sphere of its realization. It is not such a nature as to be tossed to and fro, okay, amid the superficial play of accidents, but is rather the absolute arbiter of things, entirely moved by contingencies which indeed it applies and manages for its own purposes. Okay. We'll come back to this point. What I'm going to do with classical sociological tradition through the works of Hegel, Comte, Maine, Marx, Morden, Tyler, and so on. Then you will find Comte, Auguste Comte, often regarded as the founder of sociology as a discipline, suggested that the true general spirit of social dynamics then consists in conceiving of each of these social states as the necessary result of the preceding and the indispensable mover of the following. According to the axiom of Leibniz, who was writing along with Newton, okay, not along with Newton, rather when Newton was writing, he belongs to, Leibniz belongs to that era as such, that the present is big with the future, and in this view, the object of science is to discover the laws which govern this continuity, okay, in the context of evolution, in the context of social change. Marx suggested that no social order ever disappears before all the productive forces for which there is room in it have been developed, and new higher relations of production never appear before the material conditions of their existence have matured in the womb of the old society. more and more of a materialistic conception of history. That's how you will find how Marx has analyzed that how societies have traversed through different stages, starting with hunting and gathering economy, to slave society, to feudal society, to capitalist society, which will inevitably and unstoppably move on to socialism and thereafter communism. And of these societies, slave society, feudal society and capitalist society are class societies, whereas hunting and gathering economy and socialism and communism are not class societies according to Marx. Okay? Louis Morgan suggested that as it is undeniable that portions of the human family have existed in a state of savagery, other portions in a state of barbarism, and still other portions in a state of civilization. Okay? One is barbarism and civilization. It seems equally so that these these three distinct conditions are connected with each other: savagery, barbarism and civilization. Okay? These three distinct conditions are connected with each other in a natural as well as necessary sequence of progress. Moreover, that this sequence has been historically true of the entire human family up to the status attained by each branch respectively is rendered probable by the conditions under which all progress occurs and by the known advancement of several branches of the family through two or more of these conditions. Edward Tylor argues that the thesis which he wanted to venture to sustain within limits is simply this, that the savage state in some measure represents an early condition of mankind, out of which the higher culture has gradually developed or evolved by processes still in regular operation as of old. I mean, what he meant by higher culture, or it's, please don't think that it is higher culture or lower culture, but what he thought of higher culture is precisely because they have improved modes of production and so on, that the tendency of culture has been similar throughout the existence of human society, and that we may fairly judge from its own historic course. What its prehistoric course may have been is a theory clearly entitled to precedence as a fundamental principle of ethnographic research. Okay? This is what Tylor meant very emphatically. Okay? When I say higher modes of production, improved modes of production are a combination of, if you look at this, modes of production is a combination of forces of production and relations of production. Okay? If I say a force of production, it may be labor, it may be capital, it may be property. Okay? If I say property is a force of production, then property relations is a corresponding relations of production. If I say labor is a force of production, then maybe division of labor is a corresponding relations of production. And modes of production, as you know, it may be capitalism, it may be socialism, it may be semi-feudalism, semi-feudal, semi-capitalist structure, as we see in the Indian context. Okay? Because we have not yet come out of feudal hangover, feudal structure, and we are trying to embrace capitalism, okay, through various public policies and so on. Okay? That is why you will find a combination of feudal structures as well as capitalist structures as is very specific to Indian modes of production. Okay? Now, let us come to what are the elements of social evolution through the works of Nisbet again, Robert A. Nisbet. Okay. What he suggested, I mean, the theory of social evolution is more commonly dealt with in terms of the patterns of assertedly universal origins and stages which the evolutionists, the protagonists of evolution, the proponents of evolution put forward than in terms of the major premises regarding the nature of change which underlay these origins and stages. It is the premises that will form the subject of today's lecture. Okay. For they rather than the other more obvious aspects have proved to be the really durable and the most influential features of evolutionary theory. Then what are these premises? What are these basic axioms? Okay. They are drawn all of them from the metaphor of growth. Okay. This evolution, what you theory of social evolution, what we talk about, it is based on certain premise, and the premise that we are discussing now is drawn from the metaphor of growth. Metaphor of growth we will discuss in the next lecture. I mean, from the analogy of change in society to change in the growth processes of the individual organism. Okay. We are going to discuss 6 important dimensions of change, and these 6 seem to be the most constitutive and far-reaching in their relation to the theories of the major social evolutionists of the 20th century. First, change is natural. When I say change is natural, I mean natural, that is to the entity chosen by the evolutionist for her or his study. None of the theorists of social evolution ever made the mistake of supposing that change is in fact constant in a given area or period of time. It is not at all constant. Okay? It is not static, it is very dynamic. Okay? None was blind to the manifest facts of inertia or fixity in history. But recognizing this, the social evolutionists nonetheless assumed that change in time is natural, is normal, and that when fixity is encountered, it is either to be categorized as abnormal, as a kind of monstrosity, or else it is fixity or appearance or fixity of appearance only, with reality to be understood in terms of underlying forces of change, which required only further time for their manifestation. For all of the social evolutionists, the overriding problem in the study of society was that of finding proper reconciliation between what Comte called social statics and social dynamics. If you slightly recall what we have discussed, social statics and social dynamics. Dynamics, when Comte suggested, it consists in conceiving of each of these social states as a necessary result of the preceding. That is why Comte looked at Leibniz that the present is big with the future. Okay. The great error of all preceding theories of society, what Comte wrote, that and his words were to be echoed by all of the others, is that they introduced a false dichotomy between order and change. What Comte suggested, order is order in change, and change is simply the incessant realization of a higher level of order. Comte made statics and dynamics the two broad areas of new social science called sociology as a discipline, but he never failed to insist in his numerous elaborations of these two divisions upon their inseparability when it came to actual observation of things. What was true of Comte was equally true of the others in the 19th century and mostly 19th century. If you look at the works of Hegel or Comte or Marx or Tocqueville or Spencer or Morgan, Newman and Taylor. Okay. That is why to name the principal exponents of the theory of development, who similarly proceeded from the assumption that change is natural to a social entity as any of its elements of structure. The entity for Comte was human knowledge fundamentally, although he widened this in later work to civilization in its entirety. For Hegel, the entity was freedom. Okay. For Comte, social dynamics; for Hegel, it is freedom. For Marx, the means of production, the means of economic production through the ages. For Tocqueville, for example, it was democracy in the West. For Spencer, each of the whole range of society's principal institutions. For Newman, who resurrected developmentalism, okay, Augustinian developmentalism, though in a very sophisticated way, indeed ways which had full currency in the 19th century and so on. It was Christianity. For Morgan, the entity was the idea of kinship, of property and of civil government, and for Taylor it was culture generally, religion specifically. Okay? Because religion is just a part of culture. Culture is much broader, right? In each of these outstanding theories of development, the naturalness of change in time to the entity under consideration was taken for granted. In each of the basic object, in each you will find that whether it is Tocqueville or Marx or Hegel or Comte or Spencer or Morgan or Taylor, you will find in each of these the basic objective was the same: to show the roots of ongoing change in the several key forces which constituted the entity in question. Okay? That is why Nisbet emphatically kept on repeating that it was the entity, be it civilization in the large or a given institution or cultural form, for which natural development in time was claimed. It was not the sum total of geographic areas on earth. In these, as the evolutionists were well aware, divergences, exceptions and instances of stagnation or fixity could be seen in abundance. Just as Fontenelle and other philosophers of progress in the 17th century contemplated the continuous growth of knowledge through the ages, but in full recognition of frequent obstructions to such growth in any given area or period of time, so did the 19th century social evolutionists recognize such abnormalities, but without relinquishing their conviction that change is normal to mankind's institutions and its provisions are firmly embedded in the structure of each. Okay? Then change is natural, perhaps may be challenged. Okay? I think it must be challenged, okay? Because nothing is natural that way. Okay? It is based on what Comte said. It's based on what is that entity that makes change happen. No, it is the social dynamics. Marx said no, it is the changing economic conditions. What Tocqueville said, no, it is the emergence of democracy in the West, and so on. Okay. Then let us see how change is directional. When Nisbet suggested change is directional, this of course means that change we may define as a succession of differences in time within a persisting identity. All I mean, when I say change is when what Nisbet argued that change is may be defined as a succession of differences in time within a persisting identity. Okay, this change that Nisbet tried to foreground, tried to define, a succession of differences in time within a persisting identity. I mean, these aspects of this definition of change, succession of differences in time within a persisting identity, are important, and important only in their relatedness. A mere array of differences is just that, not necessarily change. The passing of time is just that, not change, and obviously persisting identity apart from anything else is the opposite of change. Taken together, however, these elements form what we call change. We see the succession of changes, and I stress the I go by what Nisbet suggests, that it cannot be only change, rather changes. It must be put in plural, because we do not know, I mean, there is nothing called the change. We must see multiple changes, and it requires analysis and deduction, however, or metaphor or analogy, to bind the plurality of observed changes into a single ongoing process. And it requires still further analysis and deduction to reach the conclusion that this single ongoing process has beginning, middle and end, that is direction in time. That is why change is directional. For each of the social evolutionists, it was essential that this direction be specified for whatever entity development was claimed, and it is in this specification that we are given the sequence of stages, which for most of us today remains the single most distinctive aspect of the theory of social evolution. Hence, Comte's law of 3 stages, under which human knowledge could be seen as having passed from the religious to the, I mean, from the theological to the metaphysical to the positivistic or scientific stage. Not only did knowledge in its fullness pass through these stages, but so did each of the disciplines, namely astronomy, physics, chemistry, biology, and then sociology, sociology earlier was used as social physics, and Comte used social physics or sociology for the single science of society, which passed through the same three stages, namely the theological stage to metaphysical stage to positivistic or scientific stage. Later Comte adapted the law, this law of three stages, to cover not merely knowledge, but the arts and institutions of civilization. Hence, to Hegel's panoramic view of the spirit of freedom, moving from its beginnings, very limited beginnings in the Orient with ever widening scope, to what Hegel believed to be its ultimate and widest manifestation in the Prussia of his day, during his time, and hence Marxist depiction of the direction of economic evolution from ancient slavery with some form of hunting and gathering economy preceding this through feudalism to capitalism and due time to socialism and thereafter communism, mature communism. Past, present and future could thus be given connection in a single directional series. Tocqueville, for example, who suggested that change that entity, he talked about rise of democracy in the West, dealt with the direction of political change from the first beginnings of the spirit of equality in the Middle Ages through the constantly enlarging dimension of democracy, dimension that he also projected into the future, where he saw the clear possibility of mass society surmounted by despotism, both characteristics having been present in at least embryonic degree from the very beginning. Unlike the other proponents of development, Tocqueville wrote little about mankind generally, and it has to be said he is the most nearly historical of all them, of them all, confining himself as he did to Europe alone from the Middle Ages and on. But the proponents of development, maybe as Nisbet suggested, developmentalists. Okay, developmentalism, in this sense in which Nisbet was describing it here, is nevertheless a cardinal feature of Tocqueville's treatment of democracy. I don't here in the context of change is directional, I need not elaborate further in any detail. For example, if you look at Henry Mine, restricting himself to legal institutions, saw the direction of evolution as from status to contract. Spencer had an evolutionary direction for everything. The most general was his homogeneity to heterogeneity, a process of directionality that covered political society as well as the fertilized germ cell. But within this, there was to be discerned the more specific patterns of growth in each institution. Louis Morgan put the direction of evolution in several ways: savagery to barbarism, to civilization. If you slightly recall, we have suggested as it is undeniable that proportions of the human family have existed in a state of savagery, 1, barbarism, 2, and civilization, 3. Okay, that as it is undeniable that portions of the human family have existed in a state of savagery, other portions in a state of barbarism, and still other portions in a state of civilization, it seems equally so that these 3 distinct conditions are connected with each other in a natural as well as necessary sequence of progress. Moreover, that this sequence has been historically true of the entire human family up to the status attained by each branch respectively is rendered probable by the conditions under which all progress occurs and by the known advancement of several branches of the family through two or more of these conditions. That is why Louis Morgan put the direction of evolution in several ways, I mean savagery to barbarism, barbarism to civilization and so on. Being the most encompassing, government as Morgan saw, passing from the personal to the territorial, property from the communal to the chattel of the to the individual and contractual, kinship from the consanguineal through several intervening stages down to the modern Western form. Durkheim, for example, in his one of the most important works, The Division of Labour in Society, took the subject of social solidarity, Durkheim's notion of social solidarity. What is solidarity for Durkheim? I mean, solidarity for Durkheim is assemblage of people in the performance of rituals. They may be economic rituals, they may be political rituals, they may be religious rituals, they may be cultural rituals. Okay? Assemblage of people in the performance of rituals for Durkheim. Okay? Durkheim took the subject of evolution or rather Durkheim took the subject of social solidarity to examine evolution, finding the normal direction to be from mechanical solidarity to organic solidarity. And so it went. No one can miss the fact that in every instance there is no exception, the direction of change found in the evolutionists, found by the evolutionists was toward the specific set of qualities possessed by Western Europe alone. Okay? That is why I want to draw your attention to the critical elements of modernization theory that we have studied, that the less developed countries would catch up with the developed countries, the less developed countries would catch up with Western capitalism, provided they emulate the social and economic patterns of industrialized nations. Okay? That is why that is why the goal was to emulate Western Europe only. Okay? That is why change is directional, which has to be challenged today. Then the third one, what Nisbet suggested, that change is immanent. Okay? If you say change is this is the third one. Okay? Change is immanent. It is immanent, that is in the entity being considered. This is true. The social evolutionists argued of society as a whole, but also of each of the major constituent institutions of society. The prime objective of the theory of social evolution was to discover the provisions of change which lay in the nature and structure of whatever it was that was being observed. This made focus on immanence or internality inevitable. Actually, immanence is the core attribute of the whole theory of social evolution. All of the evolutionists were aware of forms of change which were not immanent to the subject at hand. All were aware of impacts, events, accidents, interferences, the entire record of history in contrast to evolution. But social evolution as a theory was premised upon the study of entities. That is what we discussed for Tocqueville, rise of democracy in the West, for Comte, social dynamics, for Marx, changing economic conditions, for Hegel it is freedom, and so on. Entities are important. Okay. That is why social evolution as a theory was premised upon the study of entities, not the totality of the geographic and historical records of individuals. In the institutions of religion, of property, of kinship, of economy, lay forces, it was argued, which engendered growth. How else could change be directional, save in terms of inherent forces within culture, within each of these institutions, which in their interaction provided the necessary dynamism. Natural immanent growth could be arrested or deflected, could be and frequently was. It was still important to discover that kind of change which, assuming no interferences or mutational accidents, could be seen as inherent as a function of the system itself, even as is the growth of an organism. Here, if I look at if you look at what Comte suggested by looking at the work of Leibniz, that the present is big with the future, Leibniz's ideas are profoundly relevant as most of the great 19th century developmentalists, Comte and Darwin among them. Darwin precisely because of his revolutionary work on the origin of the species, the principle of natural selection, and so on. They were quick to perceive what Leibniz said, when I speak of the force and action of created beings. This is what Leibniz wrote in 1714. What he said, what he further wrote, that I mean that each created being is pregnant with its future state, and that it naturally follows a certain course if nothing hinders it. When Leibniz wrote these words, he was thinking of what he called monads, the essential components of reality in Leibnizian terms, and which he said cannot naturally be hindered in their inner determinants, since they include the representation of everything external to them. Okay. Later writers nevertheless this includes the 19th as well as the 18th century writers, were willing to let go of Leibniz's monadological assumptions, that those assumptions, the essential components of reality that cannot be naturally hindered in their inner determinations, and they include the representation of everything external to them. In this context, the prime task of 19th century development theory was to ascertain the course of direction of change in whatever entity or system was under consideration. Okay? That is very important. Okay. If you look at this aspect, that the prime objective of 19th century development theory was to ascertain the course or direction of change, but more was required here than merely describing what appeared to be the curve of development in the past. For unless such development could be shown to arise from the very nature of the society or institution under consideration, how could such development be declared to be a fixed law as Comte, Marx and Spencer among others so declared it. What had made indefinite human progress certain to philosophers of the 18th century was the fact that it came from forces internal to mankind, not from willful adventitious elements external to mankind. The same assumption of immanence is present in the 19th century theory of development. Comte's so-called laws of social dynamics, Spencer's development hypothesis, Marx's economic law of motion of modern society had in common a conviction on the part of their authors that the processes of cumulative directional change with which they were concerned were immanent to the social systems that were being studied. No social order ever disappears, wrote Marx, before all the productive forces for which there is room in it have been developed, and new higher relations of production never appear before the material conditions of their existence have matured in the womb of the old society. That is what Marx was as is plain as much concerned with the microcosmic as with the macrocosmic in his search for the economic law of motion of society. Under the microcosmic fall, his investigation of the internal structure of capitalism as he found it in its most developed form in England, and his imagined discovery of the elements, the internal structural elements that formed the motive power of the law of motion that could be seen in macrocosmic terms through ages of the past as well as of the present. Precisely as 18th century students of natural history assumed that in each social system there is a natural or normal pattern of change embedded within, one that will manifest itself in time provided nothing interferes with its course, so did Marx assume that in capitalism there is a natural course of development, one that can be decelerated temporarily by alien forces or accelerated by, for example, a revolutionary vanguard of the proletariat, but cannot in the long run be abrogated by human decision. Okay. For Comte, the laws of social dynamics worked with relentless force simply because they were founded on the chief properties of our species, properties which latent at first can come into play only in that advanced state of social life for which they are exclusively destined. Okay. Prior to his own time, prior indeed to himself, Comte thought with serene self-conviction the philosophy of progress, the philosophy order had been separated from one another. I mean, philosophy of progress on the one hand and philosophy of order on the other. It was Comte. Comte thought it was his supreme contribution to knowledge to show that social dynamics and social statics are but two different perspectives of observation of the same phenomenon, human society in progressive development that comes inexorably from qualities contained within. So, however thought each of the other titans of developmentalism in the 19th century, what would happen to democracy in the future, in the past, thought Tocqueville. Okay? That rise of democracy in the West, that flowed directly from the internal nature of democracy, its fixed and ineradicable contradiction between the values of equality and freedom, its ineffaceable tension between individualism and majority rule. Given these structural elements, was it not possible to deal with democracy in much the same way that we have seen Marx deal with capitalism and Comte human knowledge and culture, or within the Augustinian tradition, I mean Christianity? when Newman, for example, wrote just prior to his momentous conversion to Roman Catholicism in 1845 in his development of Christian doctrine, he was using consciously and self-admittedly the concept of development to prove that irrespective of all that had happened to Christianity since the 16th century, there was an inner power and logic of Christianity that determined its overall development, and that made Christianity of the modern age, for all its manifest differences from the Christianity of the apostles. Okay, if you look at these aspects from Hegel to Comte, Comte to Marx, Marx to Morgan, Morgan to Taylor and others, you will what we generally find. And now we are discussing Newman, but Newman went on much in the manner of the biologist. Just as there is development that comes from within a system of ideas, so is there corruption. How Newman asked, are we to distinguish between the two? The most ready test is suggested by the analogy of physical growth, which is such that the parts and proportions of the developed form correspond to those which belong to its rudiments. That development then is to be considered a corruption which obscures or prejudices its essential idea, or which disturbs the laws of development, which constitutes its constitutes its organization, or which reverses its course of development. That is not a corruption which is both a chronic and an active state, or which is capable of holding together the component parts of a system. On the basis of these developmental premises, Newman constructed what he called 7 tests by which genuine development can be distinguished from corruption. His objective, of course, was Christianity. That's why this immanent development of change must be interrogated. Okay, when his objective was Christianity, okay, the determination of what was valid and genuine in contemporary Christianity. And as we know, it was his conviction that in Roman Catholicism lay what was truly developmental, truly emergent from the original apostolic primitivism of Christianity, that formed the stated background of his abandonment of Anglicanism and his conversion to Roman Catholicism. Newman, okay, John Henry Newman. There is an element of the delicious in reflecting on Newman's great essay. The title of that work is Essay. Okay, its purpose was as strategic, even tactical, as Augustine's had been 1500 years before, and just as Augustine had used intellectual arguments to turn the tables on the enemies of Christianity, so did Newman. There is not one single crucial element of the 19th century perspective of developmentalism missing from his argument on behalf of the present character of Christianity. Truly, the uses of the idea of evolution were manifold in the 19th century. Then let us come to change is continuous, number 4. Okay. When I say change is continuous, okay, maybe we'll stop with change is continuous, and the other two, change is necessary and change proceeds from uniform causes, and the idea of progress, metaphor of growth, and others we'll discuss in the next class. But we'll end with change is continuous. When Darwin made his entire system rest upon the concept as natural selection, what Darwin said, as natural selection acts solely by accumulating slight successive favorable variations, it can produce no great or sudden modifications, it can act only by short and slow steps. Hence, the canon of natural non-facet celtum, which every fresh addition to our knowledge tends to confirm on this theory intelligible. Okay? That natural non-facet celtum means nature makes no leaps. Okay? What this theory what Darwin suggested here, the trouble was as Darwin was forced to realize the geological record even in those parts of the earth where strata of fossils were most numerous and apparently continuous, did not even begin to support the theory of innumerable finely graded transitional links, and with this the theory of non-saltatory continuous variations in time. That is thus an entire chapter in the origin of the species with the title on the imperfection of the geological record, okay, that a change is continuous. The importance of the concept that nature makes no leaps, okay, or the importance of the concept of continuity in the theory of development is obvious. How else can change be declared directional, predictable, save on the grounds of its continuity? Okay, this is important, and a full quarter of a century before the origin of species appeared, Comte also quoted Leibniz approvingly endorsing without question or qualification the view that the present is big with the future, and that nature never makes leaps. Okay. So was Marx an apostle of genetic community. This is incontestably true despite a theory of revolution. Perhaps when this is not my version, but this is what Nisbet is writing. Okay, that's what does not Marx's view of revolution reflect a renunciation of the slow, gradual and cumulative idea of evolution and of the assumption of continuity on which it is based. The answer to this question is certainly in the negative. For Marx and Engels, at least in their systematic theory, saw revolution as but a final, triumphant and more or less dramatic stage of growth, as just as continuous in its sequence of stages as anything to be found in Comte, Darwin or Spencer. Revolution in the Marxian sense is feasible and theoretically rational only when the shape of the new social order is already substantially formed within the womb of the preceding order. That is why once Marx said socialism will be born from the womb of capitalism. What Marx suggested, no social order ever disappears before all the productive forces for which there is room in it have been developed, and new higher relations of production never appear before the material conditions of their existence have matured in the womb of the old society. This Marx, the systematic Marx, believed as firmly for the advent of socialism as he did retrospectively for the advent of capitalism. Acceleration of a process even by armed uprising does not bespeak discontinuity. This is very important. If you look at this, then what we have discussed in today's lecture, we started with this is the first lecture of the third week. I mean, this is the sixth lecture. We started with Hegel's principle of development that involves also the existence of a latent germ of being a capacity or potentiality striving to realize itself. I mean freedom, okay, human freedom. Then Comte's in terms of Comte's reflection on evolution through social dynamics, Marx's reflection on evolution in terms of the changing economic conditions, Morgan's reflection on evolution through three distinct conditions, namely savagery, barbarism and civilization, which are connected with each other in a natural as well as necessary sequence of progress, and Tyler's reflection on evolution through that the savage state in some measure represents an early condition of mankind, out of which the higher culture has gradually developed or evolved by processes still in singular operation as of old, that the tendency of culture has been similar throughout the existence of human society, and we may fairly judge from its own historic course that its prehistoric course may have been, is a theory clearly entitled to precedence as a fundamental principle of ethnographic research. Then we have discussed the elements of social evolution, how change is natural, change is directional, change is immanent and change is continuous. In the next lecture, we are going to discuss how change is necessary and how change proceeds from uniform causes, and how the entire 6 elements of social evolution, what Nisbet foregrounded, can be challenged in the context of the classical sociology and the notions of social change, ideas of evolution and progress, the metaphor of growth, the metaphor as progress, the modern idea of progress, I mean which is reflected by intellectual modernism, the expansion of metaphor and progress and degeneration. Okay? Thank you.